All right, and so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for Man-Yee, and thank you very much for speaking at this seminar today. And thank you everyone for being with us today. And so today we are very happy to have Professor Man-Yee Khan with us. And so Professor Khan is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Oxford. And she has published extensively on topics of gender inequalities in the family and the labor market and time use research. So we actually got to know each other 7 years ago, where she kindly invited me on a conference on gender inequality and gender division of labor within the household. And so, yeah, I'm glad that we had this reunion today here. And yeah, but it would be better if it's in person, I guess. And so her work has appeared in many very prestigious journals, such as Journal of Marriage and Family, Demographic Research, Gender and Society, and on and on. And so she has been awarded a European Research Council consolidated grant for a research project that investigates trends in gender equality and time use in Eastern Asian and Western societies. I believe today's talk is joining on that project. And so without, before that, and so we will let Professor Khan to finish her talk first, and in about 40 or so minutes. And after that, we have a Q&A session. And so if you have any questions, feel free to type in the chat box or just say, I have a question, and then we will have a discussion afterwards. All right, and so without further ado, let's welcome Professor Khan on the talk, Time on Paid Work and Domestic Work and Total Work in East Asian and Western Societies, 1980s to 2010s. Professor Khan, now the time is yours.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Let me share the screen. Yeah, I hope I share the right screen. Thank you for inviting me. It's my honor to speak here. As John talked about, I have been researching on gender inequalities on family for quite some time. And today I'm going to present a key paper from my project that is funded by the European Research Council. The project is about measuring progress or the pace of progress in gender equalities in terms from the perspective of time use. The project is about in the midway now. There are 3.5 years more to go. And I'm actually recruiting new researchers to join my project. If you're interested after listening to this talk, feel free to message me and we can chat about it. Focusing on today's talk, I'm talking about gender revolutions. And this is a hot topic forever discussed topic about whether the gender revolutions, that's whether progress in gender equality is continuing or come to a point that it's come to a stallation. People measure it in different ways, but from my project, I try to measure it, seeing the amount of time men and women spend on different types of work, paid work, domestic work, and together these two types of work, the total work time. Today I present the findings based on 3 decades of time use data from East Asian societies and Western countries. These are the co-authors of these papers. They are the first cohorts of my projects. They are collaborators, visitors, and also postdocs. These are some of them have, since the lockdown, moved back to their countries, and some move on to permanent jobs. And I'm recruiting 2 new to join me. And there are new members too, but these are the first cohorts and they are collaborating on this paper. And this paper, after several rounds of reviews, now this paper is forthcoming in Gender and Society. I hope that in the next issue also. About my project, Gen Time, what is it about? I've been thinking how to measure progresses in gender equality. how to say that one country is doing better or one country is doing less well compared to others, or especially it is involve cross-national comparisons in different time points. There are common indicators we use, such as the gender wage gap, or what types of jobs women and men do in terms of gender occupational segregation. There are indicators showing proportion of women in senior positions, such as proportion of women in members of parliament. These indicators are very important to show us the progress of a society in gender equality. However, there's one thing that this indicator cannot measure, that is inequalities in our everyday life. How do we spend our time? And how is our quality of life? And what are the implications of our use of time and the later life course outcomes, such as employment, opportunities, and fertility, satisfaction, and well-being? So in these projects, I try to look into these aspects, looking at gender equalities by time use. There are, in terms of time use research, there are abundant. It's quite a lot of research based on Western societies, Anglophone European countries, because there's quite a lot of data available in these countries. And in East Asia, is relatively, there's no holistic central data archive that we can easily get the data and do the comparisons. So in my projects, the first stage is I gather a bargain for access of these time use diaries. One of the key data of my project is time diary data from 4 East Asian countries in the first instance, as China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and then make them comparable, harmonize this data. Time diary data typically ask respondents to fill in what they are doing, do it on a sample day in every 10 minutes or 15 minutes slot. And this involves different statistical agencies to collect this data, so they are not, and in the first instance, not comparable. So I asked my team to help me to harmonize this data, make them comparable within East Asia comparisons, and also for East Asian and Western countries comparisons. And pure studies, because based on a lot of basic, mainly from European or Western country data, they are a lot of our previous understanding of gender revolutions and gender theories are quite tested, quite predominantly by this data. I hope that bring in East Asian data, give us more understanding of, outside the dominant Western paradigm, what the picture will be like. And whether bringing in East Asia as another cultural backgrounds, historical context will give us insight in understanding what we might have missed in the past study, whether they are, for example, alternative path of gender constructions, whether we have overlooked some cultural factors in affecting gender equality's progress or not. So that's what I've said. I harmonize this country's data, our society's data, and then make them comparable with Western countries' data. And coming back to this paper only, today's talks then is the first output, first key outputs. Let's say there are other papers, but this is, I would like to think, is a flagship of the project. I use the harmonized data, which is the aggregate level of data have been done. So I use this to the harmonized data to study time trends in the last 3 decades. We look at gender revolutions in pay work time trend and domestic work time trend, total work time. Then we look at the last 3 decades and answer some questions that that have been tried to past studies so to answer this question before, but we want to see whether what are the new insights from this. First is the gender revolutions, say, by looking at gender convergence in time use between about these different kinds of time, paid domestic work and total work, whether it is continuous or it is come to a stagnation. Second is past studies, they say that if we look at paid work and unpaid work, at these two work together, look at total work. Past studies, time use research say that men and women have more or less equal amounts of work. It's just how to divide these types of work. But I have a large question because it seems from gender revolution theory, which I will show later, it seems the implication gender revolution, especially in the first stage, implying women will have longer work time. So I want to look at this question again, whether women really have equal amounts of work that compared to men, or women actually work longer. Third is what are the roles of welfare policies and cultural context in affecting the trends in the gender equality progress in terms of time use. As I said, past studies sought to answer this question use data and welfare typologies derived from Anglophone European countries. Therefore, we might have overlooked some cultural backgrounds, factors, or some alternative paths of gender constructions. And what have they found is, including one study done by myself in 2011, if we use Western cultural data and classify the trends according to welfare regimes, then we find that there's a continual convergence of men's and women's paid work and unpaid work time. That is quite optimistic pictures, no matter what welfare regimes types, even like South European types like Italy, Spain, that's more gender traditional types, highly gender unequals. We see the trend is converging, just the pace difference. Say in Scandinavian countries more favoring gender equality policies, the trend is faster, but for less gender-friendly countries seems is also converging. So past studies show a continual convergence, and the progress is continuous. It's just different paces. However, in other studies, say looking at progress in gender role attitudes, asking people attitudes, egalitarianism in attitudes, or we measure gender pay gaps, the closing of gender pay gap or gender segregations. Many studies say that they actually come to a stagnation, especially in the last decade. So is it real that we should, in this study, I want to see whether in terms of time use, we have continued progress or not. Another is past study using time use data, they argue women and men have similar amounts of total work time. And I have doubts about it, how they measure it, and bring in East Asian data or examine both East Asian and Western data again and see whether it is true or not. And there are different ways of we model or we try to analyze what welfare policies, what are the roles of welfare policies in affecting progress in gender equality. People sometimes use multi-level modeling to put in particular policies about childcare, parental leave policies, and so on. Another way commonly used is classified policy into regimes types, because it's a belief that social policies form typologies based on how much public care supports and what are the stratified, how much stratified society is, and then also gender ideology behind these policies. Well, from past studies, people classify Western countries into broadly 4 types of regimes. In liberal regimes like UK, US, Canada, there is more limited support, minimum governance, and then the characteristics is women participate in labor markets work, but on the other hand, they are also fulfilling the major role, the domestic caring role. And childcare services are generally provided by the private markets rather than by the states. In conservative regimes like Austria, France, Germany, Netherlands, the state has a subsidiary role and work closely with business to deliver the pensions and social and welfare. So there's in this kind of states a male breadwinner role and female carers assumed in social policies. However, there are also fringe parental leave policy in these countries. In social democratic regimes like Denmark, Finland, Norway, these states take on an important role in offering services and benefits for their citizens, and social policies have an aim to raise the employment rates of both men and women. And there's high quality public service to provide care and elder care. So there are also fringe paid parental leaves that aim to promote equal roles of women and men in labor markets and also in the family. In Southern European regimes like Italy and Spain, the social security systems are relatively less developed compared to other types of regimes, and social policies are built on traditional family relations, which reinforce gender inequalities, and childcare and elderly care relied on informal supports provided by the family. So past studies show that policies matter and they affect the pace of the convergence of time trends. But on the other hand, no matter which types of the regimes, the gender convergence trends continue. So what about East Asia? Is there no much consensus about how to categorize East Asian country into any types of regimes? It's commonly believed that there's East Asian countries are affected by Confucian's models of families, which emphasis a lot traditional gender roles, emphasis on a lot on family ties, that women will do a lot of care and assisting role in the family, and there's a strong breadwinner assumed for the men, and men are supposed to support the family and provide family incomes. And these ideas is believed that have resulted in large gaps in paid and unpaid activities in daily lives. However, East Asia, as we are all in East Asia, most of us in attending this seminar, we know that a fast changing, especially women's public roles in the economic sphere. We, in the 4 countries, 4 societies I studied, except the exception is China, which has a different distinct socialist history. So in a country like Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, actually, women's labor force participation rate is fast climbing, and only in China, because it starts with a very high women's labor market participation rate. So the trend in China is falling, but it's still quite high compared to Western countries. And among the 4 East Asian societies I compare, like Japan and Korea has a longer history relatively to deliver welfare policies. And some scholars classify these countries as liberal because, especially in the beginnings or in the early 80s, there's strong emphasis on individual responsibilities for this to take care of themselves in welfare, then the societies focus on economic development. And however, in these countries, in Korea and Japan, they have introduced quite a lot of gender relations and policies reform in the 80s and 90s. And in Korea, the governments especially work closely with business and corporations to deliver the pensions and insurance systems. So some people will classify Japan and Korea into the conservative types because the close relationship between governments and the corporations. And some other strands of research classify East Asian country into familiarist countries like Spain and Italy, South European type, because there's strong emphasis on traditional family ties and family network in delivering their policies. So there's no broad consensus. Sometimes we just swing between these three types. In Taiwan, the welfare system is quite market-oriented and minimal public support. Minimal support is assumed. And in the first public preschool childcare was introduced in 1986, and policy that promote gender equality in labor markets, that's such as flexible working and parental leave, were first introduced in year 2001. However, in the last decade, the government has introduced several reforms that make childcare provisions such as informal childcare subsidies and early child school vouchers available for the public. If we compare Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, we see that in the last 3 decades, they increased the public expenditures in family and other care a lot. But compared to Western countries, if you look at OECD statistics, is far below these Western countries. And in China, among the East Asian societies, China has a distinctive history. Before the 80s, the states play a strong role to promote gender roles in work and family. However, since economic reform, the state has retreated its role in mitigating women's domestic responsibilities and enforcing gender equality at work. And since then, there has been a resurgence of Confucian's patriarchal traditions in the family and in the workplace. And the family policies in China do not take gender expectation in family and domestic labor into account. So in this paper, rather than group these 4 East Asian types, we see that there are heterogeneity in their policies and background. So in Western countries, there are more concerns about how to group them into welfare policy regimes. In my project and in this paper, we don't group East Asian country into one type of regimes. Instead, we examine each East Asian society individually. So how to theorize the trends about gender equality? Past research talk about gender revolution framework. And it says that gender equality in division of labor, pay work, and unpaid work will be achieved at 2 main stages. The first stage is mainly due to the increase in education and job opportunities for women. So women have more opportunities, and for the economy of developing the economy, actually the government also encourage women to take a more public role. So women increase their involvement in the labor market work. But that brings a shock to the family because women have more time constraints when they do labor market work. That means that they have to reduce their commitment to the family. So there will be other forms of other phenomena observed, like delayed marriage, delayed childbearing age. And in terms of time, in terms of housework, we will see that women reduce their time in housework and domestic work. So that's the first stage is mainly brought in by women's changes. And then in the second stage, it is said that the second stage of the gender revolution is more about the domestic sphere, because the first stage is changes in the labor market, then bring unsettled dynamics in the family. So that's the second stage is how to settle this in the family is more about the first stage bring in more equal roles in the workplace. Then the second stage is diffuse of gender egalitarian norms, and that will bring more equal roles also in the family. That men will do more housework in the family afterwards. And people, when they study these time trends, they are looking at this gender revolution framework and say that we are coming to more like transitioning to the second stage because we see the trends continuing that both men and women change their time and we see gender convergence in time use. Another perspective I pick up as are more like to test whether it is true or will be more pessimistic picture is the multiple equilibrium. These perspectives mainly they're brought to attention by demographers. They said that societies might settle in different level of egalitarianism rather than moving towards to more egalitarianism to 50-50 equal share. Some society might just settle in less equal, but they reach an equilibrium. That equilibrium depends on the social norms and welfare policies. That's brought to attention by demographers. They are concerned about the declining of birth rates. But then they said that in the first stage of the gender revolutions, because of the unsettling of the gender roles and that bring a shock to the family, then women and men cannot decide when to have babies and they just defer it. At the second stage, they said that people are more accepting into multiple equilibrium. Some country might settle in a more equal roles, some country might settle in a less equal roles. But they observe that in most recent decades, even for the less gender equal societies, like in Italy, they see a rebound in the birth rate. So they argue that we might just see different levels of equilibrium. For example, some author they use time use studies, but they use cross-sectional rather than trend data. They try to analyze the domestic division of labor in Denmark, in UK, and in Spain, and find that there are different types of equilibrium. In Denmark, is more equal. In Spain, remain quite traditional, and in UK, they say it's unstable equilibrium. Whereas traditional male breadwinner family models is in decline, but on the other hand, women still share a large amount of housework. So this is the second perspective. So in this paper, I want to test this. First, I made some hypotheses to just guide the findings. First, following the gender revolution framework and in line with past studies using Western country data, try to portray a more optimistic picture. Gender convergence in paid work and unpaid work will be continuing over time. And second hypothesis, I try to be more skeptical because if we adopt the gender revolution framework, it's almost too good to be true. Women just have the same amount of work than men compared to men, because especially in the first phase of the gender revolution, is women struggle between work time and unpaid work time. Is women make the change. So I think I make a hypothesis. Actually, women will have a longer work time than total work time than men, especially in the early phase of the gender revolution. Third is more a myth. People often use cross-sectional data, say, for example, highlighting Japan or Korea. Gender equality is poor in this country in terms of domestic labor. So I want to test whether it's true. If you look at time trends, if you look at changes over time, rather is Asian countries follow different patterns, or are they really lagging behind Western countries. Fourth is I want to test the multiple equilibrium perspective in contrast with the gender revolution framework. Hypotheses given differences in cultural, society, and policy context in line with the multiple equilibrium perspective, there will be variations in the pace and patterns of gender convergence. So that's my 4 hypotheses. I use data from 12 Western countries listed here and also 5 East Asian countries from 1985 to 2016. They are actually earlier years. Some East Asian societies like South Korea and Japan, they have long history of collecting communist data. But the earlier the data, the more difficult they more work needs to be done to do harmonization. So in this project, I focus on from the 80s onwards. The analytical sample in this paper include working age women and men from 20 to 59 years old. Methods are simple, but a lot. The first stage is a lot of work. It's about harmonizations, collecting these data and make them comparable. Then I run some descriptive figures and do some standardizations because of the over time the age education profile change according to societies. So I use a standardizing method, standardized based on Japan's census data in 2010 about the age and education profile of respondents, just for the descriptive statistics. In the OLS models, I don't use this standardization. I just use weights to control for the uneven distributions of the diary days, because in a number of countries, they oversample the weekdays over weekends. If we look at time, we need to weigh these samples. So we regress the following welfare regime size and society independence. They each represent an equations. Conservative include France, Netherlands, and so on. Southern European countries, Italy and Spain, social democratic, Scandinavian countries, and liberal countries, include UK, US, and Canada. East Asian countries are examined individually rather than group them together. Each of them include Beijing data. There's a separate Beijing time trend survey, China, Korea, Taiwan, and Japan. The key dependent variables are measured in minutes per day, total domestic work, including care work and housework, pay work, that is work for money. Then lastly, the total aggregated work time, that is domestic work plus pay work together. The key independent variable is gender, whether there's a gender wage gap we measure, and then period variables. I group period into three phases, 1985 to 1996, and 97 to 2007, 2008, and 2016. And then in subsequent model, I test the interactions of gender and this period to see whether there's difference in the pace of the convergence of gender time use. And then controls variables include education level, age, whether it's a weekday or weekend diaries, and partnership status, whereas with partners or not, and employment status. So first of all, after all this explanation, let's just take a glance of the descriptive figures, just take a glimpse of what are the data like and which countries are here, what are the years like, and see a bit of the trends. Here I present pay work and domestic work time trends across regimes and regions countries. So we see that the axis is from 1985 to 2016, and each dot represents a survey. So these are the surveys. And the top 4 countries are East Asian countries. The bottom 4 regimes type: liberal, conservative, South European, and social democratic. The left-hand side are pay work, right-hand side are domestic work trends. But perhaps let's focus on the pay work trend on the left-hand side first, and just take a look at the gap. So men's are green lines, women's are orange lines. We see obviously there's a gap between the green lines and the orange lines. And looking at pay work time trends, we see this, just a quick glance, we see quite a big gap in Japan, quite a big gap in Korea. Then maybe in Western countries, relatively large gaps in Southern European countries. In Japan, in particular, men work very long work hours across the periods we observe. It's quite longest among all the countries. And the gender gap is particularly high in Japan. And if we look at like other countries like liberal and conservative countries, we see the gaps are relatively less, like especially in social democratic countries. But if we focus on trends, for example, we see that it seems in Japan there's no much change over time. Korea seems converging in the beginning, but more driven by men, reducing a bit of time for women's ability to change. In terms of patterns, we see maybe Beijing, China to look more similar to Western countries, especially liberal countries, relatively smaller gaps. But in Japan and Korea, probably closer to Southern European countries. And looking at domestic work time trends, it seems the trends are similar. Just a mirror image of the pay work time trends, but it's probably more story to tell, more dramatic. We can see that, for example, Japan, Korea, large gap. Women do more domestic work than men, just a reverse of the pay work time trends. And if we look at the green lines, bottom, that's very little change by men over time. If we focus on the gender revolution framework, it seems that's not happening. Men are not increasing their time in domestic work. In an Asian country like Taiwan, very flat line, domestic work. In Japan, men change very little over time, and Korea as well. So large gaps in some East Asian countries, Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. And Beijing and China look more like Western countries, again, look more like liberal countries. And the other three, especially Japan and Korea, look more like South European countries, large gender gaps. But if we look at the trends again, we are concerning whether it's closing. It's not just the size of the gaps. So liberal countries, it seems it's come to, just by observation, seems to come to quite stable gap over the years. In conservative countries, we see the gaps is narrowing down over time, is starting maybe bigger, but is over time is narrowing down. In South European country is closing maybe very slowly, but in recent decades not clear. In social democratic countries, closing in the beginning, but in terms of recent decade is less clear. So let's move on to the regressions. So we want to take account of other factors, like considering is it due to education change or other age or other factors. We could, after taking into account of all these factors, we look at this summarize the regression results. Well, bear in mind that each regions and welfare regimes have represent an independent equation. I just, for the sake of presentation, present them in the same graphs. So the first left-hand side is the first set of regressions about pay work time trends. And I present the coefficient of gender, that is women. So if a negative coefficient means women have less pay work time than men. The gender gap is women less than men. In conservative countries, and this is an interaction with the control is the interaction is the first period, and then the second interaction is female interacting with year 2000, and then female interacting with year 2010. So looking at the coefficient of female in the beginning, so the gap is relatively less in Beijing because it's the less negative in Beijing and less in Taiwan. In East Asian countries, in two countries less, but the gap in Japan, Korea is on par with other countries. In conservative countries, it's quite a large gap, starting with 120 minutes. If we look at time trends, that's our main concern, whether it's closing or not. We can see that in conservative countries, it starts with quite a large gap in pay work time. In year 2000, the gap is coming to less closing, and is a continual closing in year 2010 because there's a significant difference. In Southern Europe countries, quite a large gap at 60 minutes a day. In the later two periods, there's no significant difference compared to the first period. So the gap is not closing at all. In Scandinavian countries, again, 60 minutes a day gap. And in the first period, it's closing, and there's a further closing in the year 2010. Sorry, there's no significant change difference between year 2010 and year 2000. So it comes to a stagnation rather than significant difference in the closing of the gender gap. In liberal regimes, quite a large gap, again, 1 hour a day. In the second periods, there's no significant difference. It's not significant difference from zero. And also in the third periods, there's no significant difference as well. Beijing, starting with smaller gap in pay work time. However, there's no progress in compared to the third period. And compared to the second period, actually the gap is getting, no, there's no difference in the third period. So there's come to a stagnation rather than closing. In Japan, quite a large gap, again, 60 minutes, and there's no significance in the later two periods. So it comes to a stagnation. Korea, quite a large gap, about 16 minutes again, and then the first period closed a little bit in 2000, but there's no further close in the second, in year 2000, in the last decades. Taiwan, again, is come to a stagnation. There's no difference. How about domestic work? We see large, relatively smaller gap in Beijing, jumping to the smaller gap first, but there's no difference in year 2000. It comes to the gap quite remarkably. Other countries is closing, but in Beijing, there is quite different time trends because of the history of China. The gap in year 2000 actually is increasing rather than decreasing. And then when it comes to year 2010, it remains stable. In conservative countries, it's quite large gap at about 120 minutes a day. And the gap is closing in year 2000 and continue to close in year 2010. In Southern Europe countries, a large gap, almost 3 hours a day. And we see it closing the gender gap by about 15 minutes in year 2000. However, no significant difference afterwards in year 2010. In Scandinavian countries, the gap starts with about 100 minutes a day. The gaps close in year 2000, but there's no further closing in the last decades. Liberal regimes, the gap is about 100 minutes a day in the first period. The second period closed for about 30 minutes, but there's no further closing. So it comes to a stallation. We talk about Beijing. In Japan, it's quite a large gap. It's about 90 minutes a day. In the second period, it closed a little bit, maybe 10 minutes. The second period closed a further, maybe 25 minutes or so. So it's closing extremely slowly. There's a significant difference, but closing extremely slowly. In Korea, very large gap, about 100 minutes a day in the first observation period. In the second period, is closing again very slowly, about 10 minutes of that case. And then in the last periods of observation, there's no significant difference. Closing extremely slowly, and there's no difference observed. In Taiwan, very high, very strong gender gaps at 2 hours, over 2 hours a day, and it's closing by about 15 minutes a day in the second period. We don't have the observation for the last decades in Taiwan. I seem to jump actually in total work, domestic work and total work. I seem to jump from domestic work to total work. Is it total work time? Have I talked about total work yet? Or I have talked about domestic work, is it? Let me recap a bit of the domestic work. This domestic work, I think I swapped the slides between domestic and total work. I'm sorry about that. Let me recap a bit the domestic work time because I mixed the two slides. For domestic work time, we see, let me recap the most important finding. In Beijing, the gap is quite small in the beginning. Let's forget the last slide. It's about total work time. Domestic work time, Beijing start with quite narrow gap. However, there's no significant difference in the last two periods. Conservative start with about 130 minutes a day gap and continue closing. Southern Europe, no further closing. Further close, very large gap and significant difference in the first period, but no further closing. Scandinavian countries, relatively little gap, but no difference in the last period. And East Asian country, relatively large gaps, but in Japan, no further difference in the last period. In Korea, closing very slowly, but there's continued closing. And in Taiwan, closing in the first period, but no observation for the last period. In terms of total work, I want to highlight whether women work longer than men. And in contrast of previous research, we classified women's total work time in different phases with different periods. We observe consistently women work longer than men, and that gap is not closing. Say for conservative countries, starting with narrower gap in total work, but there's no further closing afterwards. In Southern European countries, it's a very large gap, like nearly 120 minutes a day, but closing further in the first period, but no further closing in the second period, the third period. That means that come to a stallations. Scandinavian countries start with quite narrow gap at about 30 minutes again, but there's no further closing in total work time. Liberal regimes, again, starting with smaller gap, about 40 minutes again, close for about 10 minutes in the first period, but no further closing in the last decades. In Beijing, start with a smaller gap of 30 minutes a day, and then the trend is increasing rather than decreasing, and there's no further closing in the third period. In Japan's Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, quite large gap like South European countries at about 100 minutes a day, and closings very slowly at about 10 minutes, and further closing very little. So women work longer hours still. Korea about 100 minutes a day, and then close in the little in the first period, and no significant difference in the third period. Taiwan closed a little at about 50 minutes a day. So to summarize, we find more pessimistic pictures of gender revolution than previous research because we find overwhelming evidence of stalled progress in the latest period in the closing of gender gaps in paid work time and unpaid work time. So across both East Asian and Western countries, this includes UK, US, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Italy, Spain, Taiwan, and Japan. The closing of gender gaps in paid work and domestic work time has been stalled in the most recent decades in these countries. And we find supportive evidence for hypothesis too, but this goes against previous research. That is, women have longer total work time than men. This ranges from 30 minutes to 120 minutes a day across the 3 decades. In Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, the gender gap in total work time has been reducing slowly over time. In Southern European countries and liberal countries, the gender gap has ceased to close since the second period. In conservative countries and social democratic countries, the gender gap was relatively stable over the 3 decades. In Beijing, the gender gap was not so different from 0 in the first period, but it increased by 1 hour in the later 2 periods. We find no evidence to support hypothesis 3 because it's a myth, the general myth that East Asian countries lagging behind Western countries. There are heterogeneity among East Asian countries as well as among Western countries. Is this category, big categories of East Asian Westerns, thinking them as homogeneous and entities are wrong. So the patterns of Japan and Korea reveal extremely slow progress in gender equalities. These are similar with those of South European countries. Beijing and Taiwan characterized by smaller gaps in paid work and domestic work time, but stalled progress. They are more similar with those of liberal countries. Finally, we find heterogeneous patterns in the gender conversions in paid work and total work. In conservative countries, the gender gaps in paid and unpaid work time are both large, and that in total work is relatively small. The closing of gender gaps in paid and unpaid work has been continuing over the last 3 decades. In liberal and social democratic countries, and also Beijing and Taiwan, the gender gaps in paid work, unpaid work, and total work are relatively small. They just comparatively, but there has been stagnation in the progress of the closing of these gender gaps. In Southern European countries, where the gender gaps are large in paid and unpaid work and total work in the beginning period, the closing of gender gaps has been stalled in the last 3 decades. In Japan and Korea, the gender gaps in paid and unpaid work time are large, and in total work time is relatively small, particularly because of men in this country work extremely long work hours. And the gender convergence in paid and unpaid work has been extremely slow. It's continuing, it's extremely slow, but and in some observation period even stalled. So overall, what we have learned is we say that among all these numerous findings, what we have learned from them. First is no too much optimism about automatic progress about gender equalities. So we cast out to the deterministic, optimistic assumption of gender revolution framework. The increase in opportunities for women in public sphere will not necessarily bring gender equality in the domestic sphere later on. And the findings more support in the different levels of egalitarian settlements, and it's more about supporting the multiple equilibrium perspective, just gender egalitarianism might settle at different levels. Of course, we still need 1 more decade of observations to see how the trends would look like. But based on the last 3 decades, it looked like we are settling in different levels of gender equality levels. And what determines this pattern, whether it will be stored or continue? I identify certain factors. First is the initial size of the gender gaps. Also, the cultural backgrounds of societies and social policies, the regime types all played important roles in determining whether the gender revolution in division labor will be stored and continue. For example, we see that in conservative countries, the gender revolution is continuing, whereas in liberal and even in Scandinavian countries, the trends come to stallations in the most recent period. We also observe that in countries and regions that policy relies on family ties and women's traditional gender roles for care provisions, such as in the case of Japan, Korea, and Southern Europe countries, we will see very slow or stagnation in the progress of gender equality. So this call for policies makers to design their policy more carefully to break gender norms about women's domestic caring responsibilities. Yeah, I should leave some time for discussions. Thank you very much. And this is, if you have any further comments, feel free to contact me and to see my project.
Thank you, Man-Yee. And so I guess the floor is open for questions and comments. And so you can either just type in the chat box, I have a question, or you can just raise hand and I know that you have question.
为什么有人打电话跟我介绍男士会所？哪儿来的电话呀
Zhu? Excuse me. Everett, do you have a question for Professor Khan?
I just stop sharing. Let me stop sharing so
okay.
I can see you.
All right. And so if I may, I have actually have like 3 comments for a clarification question. Thank you very much, Man-Yee, for this very exciting and comprehensive presentation. And so the first question is that now we already got the idea that basically across all the countries with different degrees of gender ideologies. So basically there has been some installation of the gender revolution. And so I'm wondering that how would, for example, the use of outsourced help for domestic work may be factored into this trend. And so there has been like studies showing that actually many of those domestic helpers, as we know, are also female. And so for them, those are paid work, but at the society level, so it's actually been another form of gender inequality, right? And so the better established families can afford to outsource, but still it is a gendered pattern, gendered use of those kind of help. And secondly, I noticed that you have combined care and the housework together as a domestic work. And so I'm also curious about how the trends may pan out differently for this 2 type work. And now, especially for many of those more developed countries. And so with this rising trends of intensive parenting, so they may choose to outsource or use alternative help with housework, those more meticulous and very strenuous kind of work, but for care. And it's sometimes it might quite comparable to children's education, so they may still decided to do them on their own. And so there could be a more focused arena for gender inequality. And thirdly is another possible a diversity of the patterns according to marital status or number of children, right? And so my hunch on this is that probably the gender trends, the gender gaps may not be as pronounced for those unmarried individuals. And so it is, so basically if you're single, men and women, they're still like quite like egalitarian, especially given this opportunities for paid work and outsourced work and so on. But when it involves like family, children, it's probably a different story. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. These are all important, excellent points, and all valid. And I can understand you are very serious gender scholars, because these are very relevant and important questions. For the first questions about outsourcing, the current data set do not allow us to because it's harmonized data sets from various countries. We don't have a measurement of outsourcing yet. For some countries, if we focus on like Japan or another countries with a large sample and long history, we can look at the trends about outsourcing. But it is very important questions, and we should also know if we miss this variable, what are the implications in the findings, although we don't measure it. So if the trend currently is pessimistic, if we add this dimension, we have this will be more pessimistic.
Yeah.
Because outsourcing, we know there is a larger amount, most of these outsourced workers are women, and these are now counted as paid work time. So it will make the trends, if we take account of this paid domestic work, it will just exaggerate the gaps. We will see less convergence if we take this into account. So the present pictures do not take this into account, but it will be more complacent than it should be. But this is a very important question to look into, and we should look into it in future studies. Second is about care and housework. This is excellent points again, and previous studies, in Western country data, I do differentiate different types of housework, and it is very important if we look at trends and housework research, because if you look at the total domestic work time, we see convergent trends, but if we break down different types of housework, especially care, there are different level of convergence trends, like care and routine housework such as cleaning, doing the laundry. All these are more feminine types of housework, so it's more slow to change, especially in East Asian countries like Japan and Korea. In less gendered types of housework or less routine types of housework, like doing home improvements, shopping, buying food for the house, managing household finance, all this, they are closing faster if we break them down. In the first version, I try to break down care and housework, but there are too many figures and tables, so I didn't present them. And in some countries, they don't differentiate these categories very finely. So for cross-national comparisons, in the first paper, I want to get all the countries to see the overall trend first. But in future research, we should focus on a few countries and break down care and look into it more closely. And if just a glimpse of the results, the glance of the results, preliminary analysis show that care is more difficult to close than, more sensitive to policy regimes than total housework. And about the third question about marital status and number of children, excellent points again. In the current data set, there are not all the data have number of children, so we didn't break them down. So in the first paper, we want to increase the sample size as much as possible, but it's important to look at life course stage, married, single, having children or not, and age of the children.
Okay, thank you, Man-Yee. I think we have another question in the chat box. I guess that will conclude our today's seminar. Actually two. So probably Liang can ask first, and then Guoya can ask, and then Man-Yee, you can answer both questions together. Does that sound okay? Liang, are you still here? Seems So,
Hi, Prof.
hi, Liang. Do you want to ask
Ye-
questions directly?
Yeah, actually, I wrote it out, but sure, no problem. I can read it
yeah.
out as well. So earlier this year, I understand that the Chinese divorce court actually tried to quantify homemaking in a divorce proceeding. So the court actually awarded the wife 50,000 yuan for 5 years of unpaid work, which is, from what I understand, significantly below that of domestic worker in China. So from your study, I understand as well that you have provided great useful data on how there's a difference between paid work and domestic work hours. So I was wondering, how would you suggest would be the best way to quantify these differences in paid work and domestic work? Whether is it for the purposes of a divorce proceeding or just generally for how do we measure this inequality? Thank you very much, Prof.
Thank you, Liang. I think Guoya has a similar question. And Guoya, are you still here?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can ask the question.
Okay. Thanks, Prof. Thanks for our presentation. My question is very similar. Like from the perspective of total work, it sounds like we treat paid work and unpaid work quite similarly or equally. So I think if we could include the differences between them, like their value or their work intensity into account, that's my question. Thank you.
Man-Yee,
Yeah, I think these are very good questions. I try to use my knowledge as much as possible to answer them. The current methods in current research, they try to calculate what are the foregone values of this unpaid work. They use, as long as I understand, my colleague in Japan, they use the NTTA accounts that they will, for example, they will calculate different types of housework, say cleaning the floor, they will use the market rates. Say if I hire outsource worker to clean the floor for 1 hour, what's the hourly rate, and calculate what it should be. Say looking after the children, if I hire a private nanny for that 1 hour, what's the rate to calculate the value of unpaid work. This is a fair market rate, but it almost assumes perfect exchange. But we are social scientists and we are feminist scholars. We know that perfect exchange doesn't exist. We forgone also our human capital development opportunities. If women spend 1 year just looking after children, when she will enter the labor market, we will affect her job opportunities and her educational level will be less used. So just in my opinion, I don't know how to operationalize it. We should calculate this according to the females, the women themselves, rather than the market rate, because the market rate outsourced workers have different qualifications than the women themselves who enter this marriage and end this marriage. We should calculate using similar educational level and qualifications to see if continuously compared to other women with similar characteristics, if they continue to work rather than getting married, what is the paid? So I'll calculate back the foregone years of income for that woman. Of course, this on a policy level is very difficult to operationalize, but at least I think we should fit in educational level of the women or the initial labor market before marriage, the status of markets, and estimate what are the market value of the women will be like to calculate the compensation. And for total work, I think it's similar. It is, of course, it's total work but I want to highlight total work is not only because of the exchange value, it's also the implications of, because my project looked at the later life course outcomes. Say, when I say I present once and say 2 hours difference, and at that time I use Ali Hochschild's famous phrase of second shift. I say there's evidence of second shift, and there's one audience comments, 2 hours, is it significant? Second shift, is it great difference? 2 hours a day. So it's,
Yeah.
that calculates it's over 700 hours a year. If you think 700 hours a year, what you can do, free time, you can learn a hobby, you can learn a language, you can join a develop your social network, you can start a new business. And in terms of well-being, there's a lot of implication about health. You do 2 hours doing exercise. And so it's more about not only inequality in the current state of exchange value in the current state, but what is the implication of future income and future well-being as well. So all this, I think, cannot be quantified so easily. But if we want to quantify exactly the current status quo, I think we need to take account of the foregone values of this time, what's proportional to the qualification, age, and experience of that of women, rather than just use market rates. It's the standard practice now how to calculate the pay.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Professor Khan, and thank you everyone for joining us in such a exciting and meaningful topic. And yeah, and so if there's no further questions, and that's the end of today's seminar. And I hope everyone will have a great weekend. Thank you very much, Man-Yee.
Thank you very much. And feel free to contact me for further questions. Yeah.